The culture of South America is an interesting one, and it makes South America a very unique place where the entire continent, it's really easy to move around from one place to another because most of it is the same language, and most of the continent also has this shared history and shared culture of having been inhabited and taken over by the Spanish. And even Brazil is not that much different because they were taken over by Portugal, which is very similar in culture to Spain. However, the main culture is Spanish. It's the major European culture that's going on. There are some areas that are very European, and a couple of them are Argentina and Uruguay. And, to look at it, a good case study of it is to look at some of their soccer players. Okay, and so I've got these pictures of their soccer players, and Messi's from Argentina. We know that probably. Okay, but then we've also got a soccer player here from Uruguay. And so if you look at these men, they don't look like mestizos. They don't look like Mexican people or anything like that because in these countries it's very, very European. A lot of the natives were driven out of there, leaving white people, kind of like the U.S. was. And so, their looks came from that European culture, and, music has come over, like the tango and things like that are very popular in the area. The other thing that has come from that Spanish culture is that most people throughout South America are Roman Catholic people. However, there is a native culture, and the native culture is kind of growing and getting better, but usually, or most of that native culture occurs in the Andes, up in those countries. And so, there's this traditional way of life. And so native textiles are popular and native music, and there's many native languages still being spoken, and they're still raising llamas and alpacas to use their wool for their clothing. And this is happening in countries like Peru, Ecuador, and Chile. And then the most native of them all is Bolivia. And Bolivia, not only is it primarily native people that live there, but they have actually elected a leader in 2006, Evo Morales, this man right here, okay, and he's the leader of the country. And he is a native, and he's the very first native leader to be the leader of a country in over 500 years. And so what he's shooting to do is restore the rights of the indigenous and restore the rights of the natives and their culture. So now we can look at the environmental problems. The first environmental problem is the destruction of the forests, and so that deforestation that's happening all around the world and is a problem is also a problem here. One really good example of it is the Valdivian forest in Chile, where it's being destroyed way too fast. We're eventually going to be completely without a forest in that country because of it. And much of these forests are being destroyed due to logging and gold mining. So logging, they're trying to get the wood, and that's the end goal. The end goal of the deforestation, but the gold mining is kind of weird. Why would that destroy the forest? Well, they bring in this heavy machinery, and they have to remove riverbanks and cut trees and do all that kind of stuff so they can move this machinery around to get into the gold. So the forests are being destroyed just by that search for gold. The other thing that forests are being destroyed for are to make room for the roads. And so the goal of making the room for the roads is there's this huge highway in Brazil that's set up and super nice, and they're trying to link all of these other countries from the Pacific Ocean on, Chile and Argentina, all these other countries want to link up to that highway so they could trade much more easily all across the continent. And so, good thing for the economy, but a bad thing for the forests. The other thing that's happening is air pollution, and it's a special kind of air pollution that we really haven't talked about yet, and it's called smog. And what happens is there's mountains out there, and you can kind of see this picture of smog as this bottom picture here. And they're mountains, and warm air comes over these mountains, and it doesn't cool down super quickly, and it stays warm. And so as it comes in, it creates a pocket of warm air way, way up high. And then there's cooler air down below in the cities like Santiago, Chile, where there's 600,000 vehicles. All right, and so what happens is this air, this cold air, wants to fall and the warm air wants to rise, but the warm air is already on top and the cold air is already on bottom. And so that cold air just stays down there, and it just stays in these towns like Santiago, Chile, and it fills up with car exhaust, but it doesn't go away anywhere. It doesn't dissipate. It doesn't get better. And so it just gets more and more concentrated, and more car exhaust gets stuck in it until it turns into smog. And smog is like a fog made out of pollution, and so it's really gross. And there's all kinds of kids. There's more kids with breathing problems in Santiago, Chile than on average around the world. So it's causing big problems. Also, another thing that you've already studied is water pollution, and water pollution, like in Lake Maracaibo, is happening a lot from oil. People are oil drilling, and some of the oil is getting out there, and chemicals they used on their machines and things like that. And then people are eating the fish or using the water, and it's increasing cancer rates. So now we're going to talk about the richest and poorest nations in the area, and the richest nations are in that southern cone. And so Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina are really the richest nations of them all because they have a lot of great resources and access to trade and all that kind of stuff. But remember, it's called the southern cone because it's kind of like an ice cream cone, right? The whole country is, and that's the cone part, and the rest of South America is the ice cream. And so the cone part is definitely the richest part. The poorest part is Bolivia, and we talked about Bolivia in the history section and how it lost its coastline in this war. And so when it lost its coastline, when it lost where it touched the water, it also lost its ability to trade with overseas countries, and so that cost it a whole lot of money. And you can see in this bottom map here what Bolivia used to look like. If you look at Bolivia, which is the white right here, and then all the other colored things around it, it used to own all of that land, but slowly throughout the years, because of war, it has lost all of that land and become a landlocked country that really is just stuck in the middle of the mountains that can't help but be poor. Throughout the Andes nations, throughout the areas that are in the mountains, there are many barriers to economic growth. It's hard for them to grow and get better. And so how do they make their economies better? Well, we know the problems with having one product. We've talked about Venezuela, we've talked about coffee in Brazil, we've talked about a lot of different things where the economy really struggles when all they have is one product to sell and one product to make. And so these countries have started to diversify their economies, and diversify means to depend on many products. So you're making many products and selling many products. That way, if one of them goes down, you can kind of convert and put some of your resources in the other ones. And so, depending on the climate, some of these countries have many different kinds of crops that they can use and sell. So different kinds of farming, food and stuff like that. They also have gotten heavily into mining, into chemicals, creation of chemicals, and into transportation. So building cars and things like that. And most of these big companies have been invested in by foreign companies. So foreign companies are bringing their manufacturing plants into South America. One of the things that also has helped the economy become better is Mercosur, and Mercosur stands for Mercado Común del Sur. And so what that means is right here, this is the English translation of it, the Southern Common Market. And so it is a connection between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, and they have agreed that they're not going to have any tariffs between those countries. And so the idea is kind of like NAFTA, but it's also like one we're going to study later called the European Union, because they're not only allowing goods to move freely, but they're also allowing people to move freely between the countries without the use of passports and all that kind of stuff. And so in South America, most of these countries, the ones that are in Mercosur, are able to move freely and do those kinds of things. So the goal is to have all of South America part of Mercosur, and to have it become this place where, they're all connected very well. And so you can see the Mercosur countries here. They include Venezuela as well as those 4 countries that I talked about before. And then all the ones in dark blue, like Peru and Bolivia and Chile, are associate members. So they have some of the same rights, but not all of them. So they're trying to work them into it. There's also the Andean Community of Nations, which include those other countries like Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, this whole area over here, and they have the same type of thing, same type of agreement of free trade, and they recognize all the members of Mercosur as associate members for them. And so both of them have their own thing, and then they recognize the other ones as associate members. There's also a trade agreement between Chile and the US that has helped Chile a lot. And so now democracy, we've talked about a lot of the issues with democracy in the history slideshow, but democracy has now returned, and the countries have vowed to never go back to the terror that they had before, with hundreds or tens of thousands of people dying and being thrown in secret torture prisons and all that kind of stuff. And so they've become many countries that are set up a lot like the US, with 3 branches: executive, legislative, judicial, all that kind of stuff. And like I said, they've promised that they're going to eliminate those times when people had to be afraid to say anything or do anything. And one example of it is a corrupt president they used to have, this guy, Alberto Fujimori. He was sent to jail in Peru because of his connections with corruption and being bribed and things like that, and also abusing people's human rights, killing them and sending them to torture prisons and things like that. And so all these countries that are kind of resetting and setting up their countries in democracy, they kind of have to decide, do we want to build a whole new constitution and start from scratch, or did our constitution have some good things and we just want to amend it? And remember, to amend a constitution, an amendment is a change to the constitution. And so do we start with a whole new one, or we just change the one we've got? But really, for a lot of these countries, the future looks really bright. They have a strong democracy, they have close economic ties, and that's building up the area. And now we're going to talk about the country of Brazil, of course, the big, huge country that gets its own section because it's enormous. Okay, Brazil's most famous probably around the world for its soccer. It's their national pride. It's the most important thing. They work on it on all levels. People just dream in Brazil of becoming soccer stars and becoming very rich. But there's a lot more to it than that. The culture is interesting in Brazil. Like I have said before, is the Africans and the Portuguese and the natives throughout 400 years of Brazilian history have mixed together and intermarried and married with each other and had kids and all that kind of stuff. And there's been this huge long-term cultural exchange. And so the culture has really become this mixture of African culture and European Portuguese culture and native culture. And it's really interesting. And one really good example of this is Carnival. And remember, we talked about Carnival in some other countries, but the biggest Carnival celebrations in the entire world happen in Brazil, in Rio and Sao Paulo and all of their big cities. And so remember, Carnival is this celebration before Lent. And so right before Lent happens, before the Catholics go into 40 days where they have to fast in some shape or form, they have big feasts and celebrations. And so in these huge carnival events, all of these 3 cultures shine, and you can see African dance and music, and you can see native clothing, and you can see that European religion all coming together to make this amazing event. Okay, as far as religion goes in Brazil, it's mostly Roman Catholic like the rest of South America, but the diversity is increasing. We're seeing other kinds of churches, as well as small populations of Muslims and Jewish people and Mormons and all of these other religions. The Brazilian environmental issues are similar to the other ones, but we'll kind of talk about them in particular. One of the big Brazilian issues with these huge cities is that they have problems with urban pollution. And so all these people so close together in a city, it causes a lot of pollution. You have many, many vehicles and many factories and things like that, and they're spitting waste into the air as well as into the water and polluting both of those very important resources for human life. The other thing that's happening in Brazil is the Amazon rainforest is being destroyed. And there's a lot of Amazon rainforest. It's very big. Much of it is very healthy, but we kind of have to be careful with it. We don't want to lose that Amazon rainforest. And there's parts of it that are being lost to people trying to mine, people trying to stop the river and make electricity out of it, and then people trying to take the wood as well. Also, people just clear cutting the forests and making farms. And so it's just kind of a scary thing that we don't want to lose, because this is a huge rainforest full of trees, which makes it a natural air filter. It takes out huge amounts of carbon dioxide and pumps lots and lots of oxygen, which we as humans need to live. We need to breathe it. Okay. And it does that for us. So it's kind of like the world's air filter. And also, it's a natural pharmacy. Many of the medicines that we have today have originally been found from plants that were found inside of the Amazon rainforest. And so they're starting to fine and punish people that are taking down the trees. But what's happening is people are just moving to more and more remote areas where there aren't any people at all, and they're taking out huge parts of the forest. Therefore, they can't get caught, or probably are less likely to get caught, because it's hard for the government to go to these places. There are other problems as well, but the government is trying to fix the problems of pollution in particular. And the first thing they're trying to do is use ethanol instead of gasoline, or along with gasoline. And it's, again, ethanol is a fuel. It's made out of sugar cane. We talked about it made out of corn before, but it's also made out of sugar cane, and they use it to reduce oil use. So instead of making your gasoline or whatever it is out of oil, you're making it out of sugar cane, and it's actually ethanol, not gasoline. The other thing they're doing is urban planning, and it's a very modern idea of urban planning. And this city down here, Curitiba, is a modern green city. And a green city means that they're really trying to be as nice to the environment as they possibly can. And so their whole plan is to make this park-like city very green, very beautiful, and they're trying to reduce traffic and reduce the use of trash. So they have heavy-duty recycling systems. They have amazing public transportation where people don't have to use cars and things like that. And they also have lots of green open space, especially around water, so that if a flood happens, it doesn't cause more and more flooding, because it's flooding on top of concrete instead of flooding on top of ground that it can soak into. Now we're going to talk about Brazil's economy as well. Brazil's economy is the largest economy in all of South America. It's large for a couple of different reasons. It's a market economy in which supply and demand is what makes the economy go, or the prices and all that kind of stuff, instead of that command economy we talked about where the government's making decisions. It just tends to work a little better. And then it's also very diversified. It has many products. Agriculture is just one part. There's many, many products that they can get, that they can use to make money. In Brazil, because it's such a huge country, there's a great wealth of natural resources, lots and lots of stuff, like mineral resources such as iron, manganese, tin, as well as energy resources like oil and natural gas. And then in the Amazon, there's all kinds of stuff that you can't find in a lot of other places, like rubber, diamonds, gold, timber, all that kind of stuff. There is a heavy amount of manufacturing in the southern part of Brazil, and really the biggest industry that they have is vehicle manufacturing. A lot of foreign car companies, so car companies from other countries, come and build their car plants there. And so most of this manufacturing is happening in kind of the São Paulo to Rio de Janeiro area. There is also farming. And some of the bigger products are coffee. It's still one of the major exporters of coffee in the entire world. A lot of their sugar cane that they're creating is being made for that ethanol that we talked about before, to power vehicles. And then Brazil has become the world's largest exporter of soybeans. Now we'll talk about Brazil's government. Brazil's government is set up a lot like the United States' government. They have an executive branch with a president, a legislative branch with two houses in the National Congress, and then a judicial branch that has a federal Supreme Court. So almost exactly like the US, and the executive and legislative branches are also elected by the people, just like in the US. The big difference as far as elections go are that you only have to be 16 years or older to vote in Brazil. Now, the big problem that the government has to deal with is the wealth gap. There's a problem of there are very, very rich people and there are very, very poor people, and there's not much else in between. And you can see a wealth gap cartoon that I selected here, and it's got this one really big guy, and he's eating half of the pie, and he's the rich guy, and everybody else is saying, "Hey, what the heck?" And the rich guy's saying, "Well, I left you guys half. What are you greedy? He only took half." But one man having half of all the money doesn't work for the poorer people. Now, how do we fix it? How do we fix this issue, and how do we help out the poor north? And maybe you have to take money from the rich south part of Brazil. Well, the way to do it is you got to have a lot of money. You got to be able to give some money out. And so to get that money, you need to use taxes. And so you have to charge your citizens with taxes. But the businesses in the South are saying, you're really going to slow down our growth, and we're going to have big issues. And so it's not a good idea because it's going to hurt the economy. But there's an understanding that social services kind of need to be added to. And so the government is thinking about using oil money as a main revenue to try and use some of that government money to help out the poor people as much as possible. So what does the future hold for Brazil? Well, there's some really good things happening that they have set up. First off, the energy independence. They have found all kinds of new oil fields, and they've really pumped up their ethanol production. And so they don't need as much oil and gasoline from outside countries. And so it's a good thing to be independent, because then if you get in a war with someone, they can't just say, "Oh, you don't get any oil," and then you have to eventually give up your side of the war because you don't have any oil to run your tanks or airplanes or anything like that. The other thing that's happening is they're becoming an agricultural superpower. A lot of different companies depend on them for crops. We talked about coffee and soybeans. They're the #1 soybean exporter in the entire world. And so many countries are depending on them, and so the countries want to keep them happy. And so the question becomes, will they use their advantages wisely? And really, only time will tell.